These are the faces of youth that for 90 minutes on the screen will shake you and shock you in a brilliant motion picture, Crime in the Streets.
1950s and early 1960s juvenile delinquency. We know the images in popular culture. The troubled rebels and frightening delinquents in movies such as 1955's Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause, and the 1961 screen adaptation of West Side Story. The hysteria that resulted in the 1954 Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, which were oddly directed against comic books and occurring roughly around the same time as Senator Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare. 1950s mainstream society's linking of rock and roll music with juvenile delinquency. And then there is the lovable greaser, a misunderstood prankster in a leather jacket with a poodle skirt wearing steady, who engaged in relatively harmless acts of, at worst, minor vandalism and very petty theft, such as the stealing of hubcaps, and who is often cited in collective memory as so unlike today's violent gangs, an odd yet now iconic fiction created at the height of the 1970s fad for 50s nostalgia. This later image, reinforced during the 50s nostalgia craze, is primarily what is remembered by today's mainstream, an object of both simultaneously quaint affection and ridicule. One topic that occasionally, though not quite as often, gets discussed are the real-life, historical 1950s-era juvenile delinquents, including the fighting gangs of the inner city who, according to the historical record as shown in surviving court documents and arrest records, news reports, and interviews with former gang members and their victims, were indeed involved in acts that would be tragically reminiscent to anyone familiar with acts of violence both perpetrated upon and by today's young. That subject briefly resurfaced in the late 1990s amidst protests by the families of crime victims during Paul Simon's ill-fated Broadway production of The Cape Man, based on the real-life story of Salvador Agron, a 16-year-old found guilty of 2 murders that were committed in the summer of 1959. Gang violence and street crime was a genuine concern during the 1950s, particularly in the news media. Real-life 1950s gang violence would find artistic or exploitive expression in the fictional teen novels and movies of the 1950s. So, how did we go from this to this? During the course of this video, we will explore both the myths that we currently hold today in regards to 1950s juvenile delinquency, as well as the real-life historical records. Towards the end, we will also explore questions as to why a more accurate look at 1950s delinquency is relevant towards understanding today's tragic acts of youth violence. And on a lighter note, later in this video series, we will also explore how a more accurate view of that time's youth cultures, including the street gangs, actually makes the popular music such as rock and roll, as well as its youth-oriented novels, movies, and fashions, more worthy of respect by today's modern audiences than previously shown by that 1970s era 50s nostalgia fad. This is a look at 1950s teens, nostalgic myths, and historical reality. Juvenile delinquency. The 1950s, an important transitional time period in American history, and a particularly relevant time in relation to teenagers. in that it was the decade that actually cemented the concept of the teenager in the larger popular culture and in the economic marketplace. It was also an exciting time for youth culture as it was the birth of rock and roll, initially a high-energy form of dance music based on rhythm and blues, but marketed specifically for teenagers. Marketing to teenagers, of course, has existed long before the 1950s, but it was during the rock and roll era that the cultural importance of youth was packaged, marketed, and sold, while, simultaneously, important social issues concerning teenagers made national headlines and were a topic of concern and debate in the popular media. Many of those issues are ones that we struggle with today. Yet, ironically, if one were to bring up in conversation that 1950s American society often addressed and dealt with issues that concerned street crime, racial intolerance, teen gun violence, and drug addiction, such notions would usually be met with derisive laughter, since, in the popular mindset, the 1950s was a simple and carefree time, supposedly before violence, before drugs, before anything serious. In other words, the 1950s can be looked upon in a condescending way as fun, yet ultimately unimportant, beloved, yet not respected. This narrative actually was the unintended result of the 50s nostalgia fad of the 1970s, as expressed in popular culture by the TV show Happy Days, the movies American Graffiti, actually set in 1962, and The Lords of Flatbush, the nostalgia bands Sha Na Na and Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids, and, most iconically and infamously, the stage play turned movie musical Grease. That particular 1970s fad and its origins, actually born as a response to the tragedies and social changes of the late 1960s, are what we remember today as the 50s. But it is a fiction. As we explore a point-by-point listing of nostalgic 50s myths in relation to specifically juvenile delinquency, at least for this episode, one real-life example from the historical record will be detailed as a counterpoint to each myth, with possible mentions of other examples. Detailing one example will give you, the viewer, specifics that you can reference later on. This first myth, the idea that 1950s-era street gangs never engaged in violence simply because they were from the gentle 50s, will be addressed first, as it is the most egregious and most often repeated myth, both in casual nostalgic recollections and even in academic historic works. The following example is confirmed via the Justia website. On August 23, 1959, 15-year-old Theresa Gee was fatally shot in a drive-by shooting committed by 17-year-old John Cruz. Like many drive-by shootings, the girl was actually not the intended target, but rather an innocent victim in a case of mistaken identity. The weapon used was initially reported by the press to be a modified toy rifle made to utilize real bullets, but as author and researcher David Van Pelt notes, the weapon used was a Remington nylon 66 .22 caliber rifle. This, according to the Assistant New York District Attorney Reynolds. The 1959 drive-by shooting was a result of a rivalry between two gangs, the Sportsmen and the Forsyth Street Boys, from Manhattan's Lower East Side. It came after 3 years of a tenuous truce, held together largely through the efforts of the Reverend-turned-gang outreach worker, dubbed by Life magazine as the peacemaking priest of gangland, C. Kilmer Myers, a real-life inner-city hero, who will be the subject of our last video in this series. However, his program, like any other, depended on funds, specifically for the employment of mental health professionals who provided therapy to the young people in his care, as well as for youth activities such as sports programs. When that much-needed funding to his program was cut by the city, the reason being that Reverend Myers was supposedly coddling or protecting the gangs, the conflicts resumed, with tragic results. There were, of course, many instances of youth gang violence involving firearms throughout the 1950s, with the most infamous being the 1952 Civic Center dance party shooting in San Francisco, committed by 19-year-old Robert Arthur Ranson, and later covered by Look magazine a year later. Other examples include the 1955 gang shooting of 15-year-old William Blankenship, involving the rivalry between the Navajos and Golden Guineas street gangs out of New York. The 1955 Chicago drive-by shooting committed by 14-year-old Clement Cookie Massis, the 1957 drive-by shooting of 18-year-old Emily Guzman in Los Angeles, and the 1958 shooting of 17-year-old Michael Ramos, committed by rival 20-year-old Ramon Serra in New York, apparently for giving the former a dirty look at a local candy store. The firearms usually involved shotguns or a variety of pistols, and when those weren't available, the machine shop-made zip gun was also used, though, being amateurly made and lacking rifling, these homemade contraptions were unreliable and often blew up in the hands of the user. It would be correct, however, to say that teens in the 1950s did not have access to automatic assault rifles, since the Colt AR-15 SP1 sport rifle only became available to the general public in early 1964. Gun violence in our schools is sadly an extremely relevant issue that has rightfully garnered media attention within the last 2 decades. Tragically, despite remembrances and collective memory to the contrary, it is also an issue that has existed for many years, too many years, as this story from 1956 illustrates. This is then 14-year-old Billy Ray Prevatte, who had a history of violent behavior. In 1956, he had been expelled from a Raleigh, North Carolina school after threatening a teacher with a knife. However, 6 weeks later, on May 4, 1956, at Pleasant Seats Maryland Park Junior High School, Prevatte was reprimanded by the gym teacher for being disruptive. When instructed to write on the board 100 times regarding his misbehavior, he defiantly completed only a portion of the repetitions. His defiance earned him a visit to the principal's office. Principal John Rezzo instructed Prevatte to wait in the hall, but the 8th grader left the campus, only to return later, smashing the school's wire fence with a car. Now armed with a .22 caliber rifle, he dispersed the witnesses to the crash by firing in the air, before stalking over to Rezzo's office. Upon entering, he told the receptionist he was looking for Principal Rezzo, to kill him. Her screaming brought the attention of Francis Wagner, the physical educational teacher, who, upon attempting to disarm the boy, was shot, losing consciousness. Prevatte then made his way to a class taught by 8th grade teacher Fraser Cameron, shooting the teacher twice, grazing him in the head with the first shot, but shooting him fully in the chest with the second, killing him. Robert Hicks, another teacher, attempted to disarm the 14-year-old, but like PE teacher Wagner, got shot instead. It was then that the police arrived and they were able to apprehend the boy without further injury. Prevatte was initially sentenced to life after an unsuccessful plea of insanity. However, According to the December 10, 1988 issue of the Washington Post, Prevatte was released from the Patuxent Institution in Jessup, Maryland in 1977, where he had actually served 2 terms. The Post's article described Prevatte as one of many career criminals. His adult life involved burglary and conspiracy to commit murder, who had obviously slipped through the cracks in the system.
Hi, I'm Teen Angel. You probably heard about what happened to me in my short back in '57. Well, ever since then, I've been haunting this here mall shop, because it's where I used to hang out, you know? That used to be my booth, right there, where I'd sit all day drinking colas with Betty Lou. Most of the kids now, though, drink this uncola 7-Up. Of course, we could have drunk 7-Up, too. But in them days, we figured having 7-Up with your hamburger was like wearing a bicycle clip on your chinos. We thought nothing could beat out a cola. Well, we was wrong. 7-Up, the uncola, is really with it. It's Nowsville, man.
This is the final myth concerning 1950s juvenile delinquency, and probably the one that is the most misunderstood aspect of youth culture of the 1950s. This is the 1952 arrest of 4 members of the Hawks Street Gang out of the Red Hook district of New York. The charge was the possession and sale of heroin. The 4 who were arrested aged in ranges from 18 years old to 21. The leader, Salvatore Pennino, actually was assisted by his 47-year-old mother, who attempted to throw out the decks of cut heroin out of her apartment window as Lieutenant Louis Cotell led his 6-man team to raid the housing project, where 30 decks of heroin, as well as straining and cutting equipment, were found in the Pennino's apartment. The raid was the result of another parent's complaint to the police after her 16-year-old son was found dead, the result of an overdose. In 1988, Davin C. and Dion DiMucci published The Wanderer, Dion's story. Dion, of course, was the iconic doo-wop singer fronting the Belmonts for hits such as I Wonder Why and A Teenager in Love between 1958 and 1959, as well as his solo hits backed by the Del Satins, such as Runaround Sue and The Wanderer in 1961. In the autobiography, Dion came clean about his heroin addiction, for which he was introduced to the drug when he was around the age of 14. Since Dion was born in 1939, his introduction to heroin would have been before his show business career, sometime around 1953, while running with the interconnected Fordham Baldies and Fordham Daggers street gangs. While it's true that the counterculture of the late 1960s is more well known in the public mind when it comes to illicit drug use, the use of drugs among at least certain young people, particularly in the inner cities, did indeed exist in the 1950s. One peculiar aspect of 1950s era drug use was that as inner city teens grew out of the psychological need to prove themselves in violent encounters over turf or territory, those that didn't find meaning in work, in the military, or, in rare cases, popular entertainment, often descended into the junkie subculture, a separate subculture of heroin addicts that existed at the same time as the street gangs. Generally, however, most street gangs, not all, avoided habitual heroin use, since a heroin addict was physically unreliable in a street fight. Marijuana, however, was used by some gang members as a softer, less addictive narcotic than heroin to calm down, usually after a gang fight. So how did the myth of harmless juvenile delinquency, being the result of hysteria and nothing more, come about? It seems that the mild rebellion of young people in the 1950s particularly those of the suburban upper middle class, a rebellion against certain social mores that, by many of their own accounts, were unwritten and stifling social norms, was often classified as delinquency and oddly put in the same category by mainstream authority figures of the time as actual, violent, inner-city youth crimes committed by impoverished teens in places like New York, San Francisco, Oakland, Chicago, and Los Angeles. This is an important historical point. Too often, the subject of 1950s juvenile delinquency and the hysteria that accompanied it is usually brought up in separate discussions distinct from the subject of 1950s street gang history. That hysteria over juvenile delinquency is rightly remembered to being tied to the near destruction of the comic book industry, with the formation of the Comics Code Authority self-censoring body being the result, as well as being followed by the even more remembered anti-rock and roll controversy, which connected the music culture with teen crime and antisocial behavior. While it's true that not all juvenile delinquents of the 1950s were necessarily inner-city gang members, the aforementioned active school shooter Billy Ray Prevatte being an example, actual inner-city gang violence was usually in the minds of adults who were concerned and admittedly paranoid over the subject of youth crime. It gets even more confusing when you look at the term gang. Too often, not just in nostalgic discussions, but also in some, supposedly history books, the term gang is used loosely, literally applied to any grouping of young people self-identified with a group name. Time Life's The Rock and Roll Generation, Teen Life in the 1950s, supposedly a history book, is guilty of this miscategorization, making the, in my opinion, erroneous claim that less than 1% of street gangs were violent, which is ironic since both Time and Life magazines actually covered several cases of inner-city gang violence during the 1950s, such as the Cape Man case in 1959, as well as that year's gang war in Manhattan's Lower East Side, and the 1957 Michael Farmer case. The term gang, as defined by academics who actually study the subject of inner-city crime, refers to a conflict group and not a social activities group. This is a very important distinction when discussing the subject of 1950s youth gangs. A group of young people who might wear embroidered windbreakers with the name of their club, but does not, repeat, not, engage in violent antisocial activities for the perceived protection of their neighborhood turf from any and all strangers to the neighborhood, whether that stranger has violent intent or not, while also engaging in illegal activities, including but not limited to theft, assault, or illicit drug sales, is not, by definition, a gang. A group of teenagers that refrain from such activities are a teen social club. A hot rod club, so often confused in the public mind as a street gang, is also distinct. Teen hot rod clubs in the 1950s, particularly those that would later fall under the governing body of the National Hot Rod Association, might have initially engaged in technically illegal activities, such as the admittedly dangerous practice of street racing. However, due to that organization's clamping down on such activities, the majority of hot rod clubs of the 1950s became, for the most part, law-abiding, recreational, hobbyist associations for young people. Though they wore embroidered jackets and sometimes had club names similar to actual street gangs, generally hot rod clubs, like teen social clubs, did not engage in violent rumbles over turf or perceived territorial boundaries based upon neighborhoods and ethnic racial divisions. As mentioned, these hobbyist organizations from the 1950s are often confused with actual street gangs, but in all fairness, nostalgic representations like Grease aren't the only ones responsible for that misperception. Some teen movies actually made during the 1950s also portrayed this misrepresentation. Many adult authority figures in the 1950s and those teachers and parents who listened to them had a fear that if their upper middle class youth didn't follow the social norms of the time, which included the way that the young were supposed to behave and dress, as well as the music that they were supposed to listen to, with early rock and roll being African American in origin as a definite no-no, then there was a chance that their own upper middle class youth could degenerate into becoming actual juvenile delinquents, such as the violent gang members that were just covered. That was the supposed belief. Of course, there were many intelligent adults in the 1950s as well. These select outreach workers did explore the actual causes of inner-city youth crime. Unfortunately, these rational 1950s adult authority figures are overshadowed by the more paranoid and misguided adult authority figures of the 1950s, such as the psychiatrist Frederick Wortham, who, though he was progressive in the issues of racial tolerance, also popularized the absurd notion that comic books somehow caused juvenile delinquency, an exaggerated point from the argument over the effects of popular media upon the young. Admittedly, the effects of popular media on young minds is a valid argument that we actually still engage in today. In fairness to Dr. Wortham, as wrong-headed as he might have been, at least to comic book fans, a series of murders committed upon New York's homeless by a group of high schoolers in the summer of 1954 was orchestrated by an admitted fan of comic books. In all likelihood, the 18-year-old leader of this group of Brooklyn thrill killers, a self-hating admirer of Adolf Hitler by the name of Jack Koslow, would have committed these horrendous acts anyway, finding inspiration and justification through other outlets besides comic books. One of the ironies of the 1950s in relation to juvenile delinquency is that upper-class suburban teens who mildly rebelled against stifling social norms through the use of clothing such as leather jackets and music such as rock and roll were often punished, and in relation to their mild acts, rather harshly. On the extreme end, real juvenile delinquents, such as 18-year-old Joseph Swartz, who led the fatal gang beating of 17-year-old honor roll student Alvin Palmer in Chicago, the aforementioned Cape Man Salvador Agron, who was convicted of stabbing to death two 16-year-olds in a Hell's Kitchen playground in 1959, or 16-year-old Douglas MacArthur Clark, one of 9 teens who murdered 26-year-old Penn State Korean exchange student In Oh Ho in Philadelphia, were often treated with a sort of pity, where society was blamed for the perceived failure to these admitted young killers, and where social activists such as former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt fought for clemency in regards to punishment for these particular young people whose acts of violence resulted in tragedy. This would lead to arguments in the press over coddling of gang members, the arguments sharply drawn by political views between the right, conservatives, and the left, liberals. In short, suburban middle-class teens who didn't follow rules of conduct were punished, while inner-city teens who, at times, were responsible for committing physical harm, sometimes resulting in death to both their rivals and occasionally innocent civilians, were pitied out of a sort of societal collective guilt. And it's the former occurrence rather than the latter that is remembered today in the narrative of innocent 50s nostalgia. 1950s society's reactions seemed extreme at both ends, and it begs the question, when does reasonable awareness of social problems degenerate into paranoia? When does the reasonable addressing of social ills turn into overreaction? And when is punishment for crimes too soft, too harsh, or just? On the next episode of the 1950s Nostalgic Myths and Historic Reality, Rock and Roll and Teen Fashions. How did we go from an African-American based music form, much of which was born on the streets, that was youth-based and charged with excitement, to a quaint and silly form of old music that's often looked upon with light-hearted ridicule. How did teen fashions that reflected Hollywood glamour become a costume party staple? This light-hearted but equally important look at 1950s youth culture will be the subject of our next video, scheduled for a month after the release of this episode. If you haven't already, check out the first hour-long original documentary in this channel, as well as the blog, written as an expansive and free ebook, both of which cover 1950s youth gang history. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the work and research that goes into these videos, consider becoming a Patreon patron. Patrons receive exclusive content, and your donations, which are as low as $3 a month, help me to continue bringing these videos to you, the fans of authentic 1950s youth culture.